Welcome to Retro Reads, where timeless mysteries come to life. Today a new case awaits, full of twists, secrets and thrilling revelations. Settle in, relax, and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. It was 10 minutes past 11 when I heard the click of the elevator gate and the soft footfall of Fritz approaching the orchid rooms. I knew better than to interrupt Nero Wolfe before noon unless the house was on fire or Inspector Kramer had arrived with a subpoena. Neither of those was true, but the woman standing in our office, neat coat, pearl earrings and terror behind her glasses, had managed to penetrate the force field of our ironclad schedule. That was no small feat. I had met her at the door moments earlier. She introduced herself with a slight tremor in her voice as Mrs. Enid Brawl, and she clutched a blue, high-gloss container in her gloved hands like it was radioactive. "I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe," she said. "It's urgent. Someone's been poisoned." Well, that was a line with legs. I left her on the red leather chair and crossed the hall, where I paused outside the orchid rooms. After a breath, I opened the door, not unlike approaching the den of a sleeping bear, and stepped in. Wolfe. His back remained turned, an Amazonian hybrid in his hand, and his forehead creased in critical examination. "Archie, if you open that door once more before noon, I shall have the hinges removed. You might want to see what's waiting in the office. She says someone was poisoned. Also, she brought a Tupperware." He turned at that. Wolfe's face, rarely expressive unless a soufflé had fallen or a client insulted his vocabulary, tightened slightly. "Tupperware," he said, as if the word itself were a profanity. "Plastic. Modernity in its most lethal form." He glowered. "Very well, you may bring her in, but I warn you, if she uses the phrase foodie or speaks in abbreviations, I shall require sedation." Back in the office, I offered Mrs. Brawl a glass of water and the promise of patience. When Wolfe entered, vast, slow, and scowling, she straightened like a woman summoned to court. "This is Mrs. Enid Brawl," I said. "She brings news of murder in a lunchbox." Wolfe lowered himself into the leather chair behind his desk with the solemnity of a man preparing to be disappointed. I remained standing, as usual, taking in the scene. Mrs. Brawl, still clutching the blue container, seemed unsure whether to sit, run, or faint. "I'll stand," she said, her voice firmer than before. "I don't expect this will take long." "Madame," Wolfe intoned, "nothing that disrupts my orchid schedule is short. If brevity were your intention, you would have called the police, confessed, and spared us all the melodrama. Since you are here, I shall assume you have something of interest. Please proceed." She blinked. "I didn't do it." "That is not a beginning," Wolfe replied. "It is a conclusion." I stepped in. "Start from the top, Mrs. Brawl. Who died? How? And where does this—" I gestured to the plastic relic in her grip. "Fit in?" She took a breath. "The man's name was Gregory Tile. He was an accountant, one of my regular clients. I run a small, high-end catering service, healthy gourmet meals for professionals, delivered in individual containers. I prepare everything myself, or supervise it. Each lunch is labeled and sealed. But yesterday, after receiving his usual meal, Mr. Tile collapsed in his office within the hour. They said it was anaphylactic shock." Wolfe made a noise that could have been mistaken for interest. "Food allergy?" I asked. She nodded. "Severe nut allergy, I know that. His preferences were clear. He was very cautious. His order was always nut-free, always." "Yet," Wolfe said, "he died?" "Yes." "And the lunch was yours?" She held up the blue container like it was Exhibit A. "The container bore my logo, and the police, they confiscated it. This is one of my spares, same batch. I've already been questioned. They think I mislabeled something, but I didn't. I swear I didn't." Wolfe's gaze dropped to the container. He looked as if he was staring at a sacrificial offering made of industrial polymer. "Madam," he said, "plastic is a menace to the palate." It leaches, it stifles, it sweats. It offends the dish it contains and the man who consumes it. That your victim ingested anything from such a vessel and expired does not surprise me, I added, though it does present a legal inconvenience. Mrs. Brawl's composure was fraying. This isn't about plastic. It's about sabotage. Someone did this deliberately, and I don't know who. She looked down. And it gets worse. Mr. Tyle had told me that if he ever had a reaction, he'd carry the EpiPen, but it wasn't found on him. It was missing. Now that was interesting. Wolfe steepled his fingers. You say you did not err. That implies someone else intervened. A rival? A saboteur? A disgruntled sous chef with dreams of your downfall? I don't know, she said. But I'd never... Her voice caught. Mr. Wolfe, I studied under Fritz Brenner years ago. A weekend class. He taught me how to prepare sauces properly. It changed my life. Wolfe looked up sharply. You studied with Fritz? Yes. Well now, I said, that explains how you got past the front door. There was a long pause. Wolfe exhaled, a low and grudging sigh. Archie, get Fritz. Fritz arrived 5 minutes later, towel folded over one forearm, the aroma of tarragon and butter trailing behind him like an elegant signature. He stopped just inside the threshold, eyes flicking to Wolfe, then to the woman seated across from him. Excuse me, he said with a gentle nod. You asked for me? Wolfe gestured toward Mrs. Brawl with 2 fingers. This lady claims you taught her to cook. Mrs. Brawl stood immediately. Fritz, you may not remember me. Enid Marcus, I took your class at the Astoria Culinary Studio. You taught béarnaise with clarified butter. Everyone else used oil. You said it was vulgar. Fritz regarded her for a moment. Then his eyes warmed. Ah, yes, the one who brought her own copper saucepan. You had hands that respected heat. That struck me as a high compliment coming from Fritz. Mrs. Brawl gave a tight smile. You taught me to treat food with reverence. That's why I can't accept what's happening. A man is dead. They think it was my food, but I didn't do this. I swear. Fritz turned to Wolfe. She's not a killer, sir. Whatever else may be true, that is not. Wolfe frowned. Phooey, I do not require character references. No, sir, Fritz said mildly, but I do. My name is connected to hers. If you refuse the case, I must live with the suggestion that I helped train a poisoner. Wolfe pressed his fingertips together. You presume to make this my concern? I presume only to say what I know, and I know she didn't do it. That did it. Fritz rarely volunteered opinion, and never lightly. Wolfe gave him a long, slow look, not with irritation, but with calculation. The kind he reserved for chess pieces, imported cheeses and liars. Very well, Wolfe said at last. You may return to your duties. Fritz inclined his head, then turned to Mrs. Brawl. I trust Mr. Wolfe will find the truth. That is his business. Mine is lunch. He departed as silently as he'd come. Wolfe exhaled deeply. Archie, call Saul. I raised an eyebrow. We're in? Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. We are drawn in, Mr. Goodwin, against my preference and better judgment. And if the next interruption involves plastic wrap, I shall require a priest. I pulled out my notebook. A murder wrapped in modern convenience, endorsed by Fritz himself, and already showing the stench of sabotage. It was going to be one of those cases. The offices of Tyle and Dremmer, certified public accountants, were located in a grim building on East 45th, where ambition wore wireframe glasses and preferred beige carpeting. I gave my name at the reception desk and was directed, with little enthusiasm, to the suite in back. Apparently, private investigators didn't rank high on the firm's hospitality chart. I could live with that. Inside, I found a thin, wiry man perched behind a frosted glass partition, working his calculator like it owed him money. His name, helpfully stenciled on the partition, was Mr. Dremmer, and he looked like he hadn't smiled since decimal points were invented. I'm looking into Gregory Tyle's death, I said. You worked with him. He barely looked up. We shared office space. Worked with is generous. I'm not here to collect tributes, I said. Just to understand his habits, particularly his meals. That earned me a glance. Gregory was fussy. He had a system. Breakfast at home, always alone. Lunch delivered. Gourmet, customized, portion-controlled, and color-coded. He had a spreadsheet for his allergies. Nut allergy, right? Hazelnuts, pistachios, macadamias. If it grew on a tree, he was afraid of it. I made a note. Did anyone else eat his food? Not unless they wanted a lecture or to be fired. Any enemies? He gave a dry laugh. Now, this is accounting. Everyone's polite and silently resentful. Gregory was the kind who said what others thought. He called one of our interns deceptively average and meant it as a compliment. Sounds like a hit at parties. Gregory didn't attend parties, or if he did, he brought his own water. I tapped my pen. He had a private fridge? Yes. In the kitchenette. Kept locked. Only he and Risa Collins had the code. Risa? Human resources. And a former complication. She left that part off her resume, but we knew they'd been a thing. I raised a brow. Any lingering hostility? Dremmer shrugged. More like awkwardness fermented over time. But if you're thinking someone tampered with his lunch, you'd need access, motive, and a complete lack of subtlety. Not many people tick all three boxes. I stood. Mind if I see the fridge? He pointed. Down the hall, white door, still sealed by the police. I nodded, thanked him, and made my way out. Gregory Tyle might have been allergic to tree nuts, but from what I could see, he was even more allergic to people. That kind of personality usually dies alone or in the company of something worse. And judging from the glint in Dremmer's eye, this firm had no shortage of candidates for something worse. Risa Collins had the kind of posture that made you think she had once modelled for business school brochures. She met me in a corner office lined with motivational quotes, all of them laminated. When I introduced myself, she didn't ask for ID. She just folded her arms and said, "I suppose you're here about Gregory." I nodded. "You and he had a past?" She tilted her head. "Define past." "I'm a simple man. If emotions were exchanged and subsequently withdrawn, that counts." "Then yes, we had a past." "Still close?" "Not particularly." "Still had the code to his fridge?" That earned me a long pause. "That's not as incriminating as it sounds. I stocked the staff kitchen, HR responsibility. The fridge was his, but it was in common space. He gave me the code when he ordered a vitamin supplement I had to refrigerate for him." "Generous of him?" "Gregory was many things. Generous wasn't one." I studied her. The tone was casual, but there was a flicker, something small and tight behind the eyes, not grief, not guilt, just pressure. "He trusted you?" "I think he trusted systems more than people. He trusted his routine, his containers, his allergy lists, his pills, not me." "And yet," I said, "he died." "After eating food from a container with your code." Her lips tightened. "I didn't kill him, Mr. Goodwin." "Good, because if you had, you'd probably have picked something subtler than a plastic lunchbox." Her expression cracked into a faint, tired smile. He used to say plastic was the modern man's tomb. I suppose he was right. I left her with a card and a warning not to travel far. She nodded once and turned back to her emails. Outside, I paused by the kitchenette. The fridge was sealed with bright orange tape. An officer's initials were scrawled across the label. The rest of the room was sterile, impersonal. But something about it felt too clean, too deliberate. If someone had tampered with Gregory's lunch, they'd had to know more than just his code. They'd had to know his quirks, his habits, maybe even how he ate. That narrowed the list, but it didn't shorten it enough. Enid Broll's kitchen wasn't quite what I expected. I had anticipated either chaos or charm. What I found was stainless steel, clinical precision, and a sense that everything had its place, including people. That last part wasn't going over well with Miles, her assistant, who answered the door in a white apron and an expression sour enough to curdle creme anglaise. "She's out delivering a tray to a book club," he said. "If you want to know about almond flour or chia seeds, you'll have to wait." "I'm here about Gregory Tyle," I replied. "And the meal that ended his tenure on Earth." He exhaled through his nose. "Of course you are. Everyone is. We stepped into the prep space, which looked like it had been bleached by a neurotic. Miles gestured to a stool. "She didn't do it," he said without enthusiasm. "Not that anyone's asking me." I gave him a long look. "You're not exactly bursting with loyalty." "I do my job," he said. "I'm not paid to worship her." "Still, you're paid to protect the reputation of the kitchen you work in. You might want to take that more seriously, especially when death is on the menu." He grimaced. "Enid's careful, obsessively so. Every container is cleaned, labelled, sealed, and entered into a log. I do most of the packing. If there'd been a mix-up, I'd know, unless someone tampered after it left." "Anyone ever tamper before?" He hesitated. "Not that I know of." "Uh-huh. How long have you worked here?" 18 months. I have a culinary certificate and a background in pastry. I was promised more creative freedom, but I spend most of my time slicing zucchini ribbons and wiping down counters." "So you're disgruntled." "I'm overlooked," he corrected. "There's a difference." "And you had access to the container?" He smirked. "You think I'd kill someone just to get noticed?" "No," I said. "I think you're smart enough not to poison the customer who pays for your groceries." His jaw tightened. "If this is your idea of subtle interrogation, you might try somewhere else. Try asking Enid about the delivery logs." "Oh, I will," I said, standing. "But if you remember anything else, say an argument, a strange call, or a sudden shift in the routine, you might want to mention it before the police knock. They're less charming than I am." He didn't answer, but his lips pressed together like dough that had lost its elasticity. I left the kitchen with the distinct impression that Miles knew more than he was saying, but not quite enough to risk saying it aloud. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Saul Panzer had already come and gone. Wolfe, seated behind his desk, with his eyes half-lidded and his fingers steepled, looked like a man halfway through a meditation or a mild case of indigestion. "He's efficient," I said, dropping into the red chair. "What's he found?" Wolfe opened his eyes. "A detail, subtle but telling. The container that held Mr. Tile's final lunch was not the one initially packed by Mrs. Brawl's kitchen. How do we know? Mrs. Brawl numbers her containers, a small black stamp on the base. The police inventory listed the wrong number, meaning the container was swapped. Yes. Before delivery? Presumably. By whom? That, Wolfe said, is why Saul is not yet finished. He paused to select a walnut from the bowl beside him. The delivery route, Mr. Goodwin. Saul obtained the logs. The containers are picked up by courier. The firm, I believe, is called Metrocrate. Saul visited the dispatch point. And? One driver deviated from his usual route. The detour lasted 7 minutes, unaccounted for on GPS. Sabotage? Or convenience? The driver, a Mr. Heller, claims a construction detour. Saul does not believe him. Did he question him? Politely. Heller became defensive. That's promising. Wolfe grunted. Possibly. Saul is verifying the other delivery logs. If additional containers were rerouted, we may have a pattern. I rubbed my jaw. We're leaning toward premeditated. We are not leaning, Mr. Goodwin. We are merely observing the slope. I leaned back. Anything else? Yes, he said, tilting his head. The swapped container bore no fingerprints, neither on the outer shell nor the lid. That's impossible. It is improbable, which makes it worthy of interest. We sat in silence a moment. Wolfe said, "The murder was not committed through chance. It required familiarity with routine, logistics, and personality." Meaning someone who knew Gregory. Intimately, Wolfe said. And perhaps more than that, someone who knew not just what he ate, but how. I whistled. Someone who knew he'd lick the lid clean. Wolfe said nothing. But I knew that silence meant something had clicked, and we were no longer merely solving a poisoning. We were unraveling a ritual. The next morning, I paid a visit to Gregory Tile's building again, not to bother Mr. Dremmer, but to speak to the receptionist, a lean brunette named Justine, who had an aura of efficient disinterest and a stack of manila folders taller than her monitor. "Did you happen to see Gregory Tyle the day he died?" I asked. She nodded. "He came in just before 9, same routine, coffee in his left hand, phone in his right." "Anything unusual?" She hesitated. "Actually, yes. He got an envelope, hand-delivered." "By whom?" "Didn't say. It was sealed, plain white. I asked if it was personal or for the firm. He said, neither. Private." Then he walked off. "Was it logged?" She shook her head. He waved off the sign-in sheet, said it wasn't business. "And the envelope?" "Gone. I checked his desk after the police came. No sign of it." I thanked her, left my card, and returned to the street with something new to chew on. A sealed envelope, privately delivered, and nowhere to be found. Tyle was already nervous, on edge about something. What if the meal wasn't the only thing that killed him? Back at the brownstone, I delivered the news to Wolfe, who listened without interrupting. When I finished, he opened his eyes slowly and said, "An envelope is a container, Mr. Goodwin, like plastic, but unlike Tupperware, it rarely kills, unless it contains truth." And with that, he called for Fritz to bring beer, and for me to call Saul again. Someone out there was delivering more than lunch, and we needed to know what was in that letter. Wolfe never enjoyed dealing with accountants. He once described them as men who organize numbers with the zeal of monks but none of the candor. So when he told me to dig into Gregory Tyle's professional background, specifically the financial sort, I knew he wasn't planning to handle it personally. "I want the truth, not deductions," he said, "and not from a balance sheet. Find out what the man was hiding." So I called in a favor. Fred Durkin, one of our occasional operatives, had a cousin in the regulatory division of a mid-tier bank that handled corporate audits. Over a late lunch at an unmemorable cafe on 38th, Fred's cousin, a tight-lipped fellow named Howard, let slip that Gregory Tyle had been flagged internally for irregular movements of minor assets. "Define minor," I said. 3,000 to 5,000 at a time, always small, never frequent, but spread over 4 different client accounts, and always followed by some hasty documentation, adjustments, vendor corrections, processing delays, nothing actionable, just enough to smell musty. Did the clients know? Not unless they were watching every line on their quarterly statements, but someone inside the firm noticed. That's why we were looped in. "Who inside?" "A compliance officer." "Name was Collings." I blinked. "Risa Collings?" "Could be." I made a note. "Any disciplinary action?" "Number 2 slippery, and frankly, he was well liked by clients. Clients like results, not integrity." That evening, I reported to Wolfe as he was working his way through a plate of lamb kidneys in Madeira sauce. He didn't look up. Gregory was skimming, nothing enormous, but enough to make trouble if it were discovered. Discovered by whom? Risa, perhaps, or a client, but someone saw the pattern. Wolfe stabbed a kidney with mild disgust. People do not murder over minor theft, not unless exposure carries greater cost than money. I shrugged. Maybe someone was covering their tracks. "Or exploiting them," Wolfe said. "There's an essential distinction." He waved his fork toward the window. "Find the client most likely to suffer from exposure, the man whose accounts were involved, the one with both money and secrets. That is our next step." So I went back to the files, the calls, the dry corridors of financial inquiry, and it didn't take long for one name to bubble up through the surface like bad soup left out overnight. Donald Ferven. Donald Ferven was the kind of man who made headlines but never returned calls. A real estate developer with a portfolio like a crooked spine, dozens of shell companies, short-term flips, strategic bankruptcies, and lawsuits that ended in settlements signed behind velvet curtains. It took some creative maneuvering and a veiled threat involving zoning permits and a nosy reporter, but I finally got a short meeting with his assistant at the Ferven Holdings suite on Park Avenue. The office smelled of money and nervous cologne. The assistant, a man named Clyde, who wore his suit like a uniform, gave me 5 minutes. "Yes, Mr. Tyle was a financial consultant for Mr. Ferven," Clyde admitted. They had a professional relationship spanning 3 years. Did that relationship end cordially? Clyde's brow creased. That depends on your definition of cordial. Mr. Tyle was asked to amend several reports. He refused. Why? He said the requests were, how did he put it, an insult to arithmetic. Strong language for an accountant. Mr. Tyle was principled, or self-righteous, depending on perspective. Was Mr. Ferven angry? Clyde adjusted his cufflinks. He was disappointed. He believed Mr. Tyle had confused loyalty with legality. And did Mr. Ferven threaten legal action? There was a pause. Not formally, but he made it clear the association was over, that Mr. Tyle would not be welcome in any future ventures. Any chance Fervan knew about Tyle's little side game, those irregular movements? Another pause, this one longer. If he did, he never said. Did Fervan meet with Tyle before his death? Not directly. A message was sent, confidential, personal. I leaned in. Was it a sealed envelope, hand-delivered? Clyde didn't answer. I didn't need him to. I left the building feeling like I'd shaken hands with something slick, the kind of slick that leaves residue. When I got back to Wolfe and reported what I'd found, he merely nodded once and said, Donald Ferven is not the sort to get his hands dirty, but he is precisely the sort to pay someone who doesn't mind soil. I poured myself a glass of milk. You think he sent that envelope? I think he sent a warning. Whether it was read, ignored, or obeyed is the question. And whether it was opened, I said, before or after lunch. It wasn't hard to get Risa Collings to meet again. Whether out of curiosity, guilt, or a strong cocktail of both, she agreed to coffee at a corner spot near her office that served espresso so bitter it felt like a legal warning. She ordered tea. I'm not sure how much more I can help, she said. You've already asked about the fridge, the routines, and the lunches. I stirred my cup. This time I'm asking about fear. She looked up. Gregory wasn't afraid of much, except his own reputation. And someone threatened that. Her fingers tightened around the porcelain cup. What do you know? Enough to know he'd been moving money. Not a fortune. Just enough to make a stink. But enough, maybe, to ruin a career. She nodded once, slowly. He told me. Not everything, but enough. He said someone had found out. Someone powerful. Said they'd come to him with a message. No blackmail, not directly, just consequences. Do you know who? I suspected, I asked, he wouldn't say, just that it was someone with reach. He used that word. And you believed him? Yes. He wasn't a liar, Archie, not about that kind of thing. He was vain, pompous. But when he was scared, it was real. Why tell you? Because I knew what he used to be. And I think... She hesitated. I think he knew the end of something when he saw it. I leaned forward. Did he show you anything? The message? A letter? She looked at me, eyes steady. He held it up once, plain white envelope, sealed. Said it was from the top. I never saw what was inside. What happened to it? I don't know. I believed her, partly because her voice cracked at the edge and partly because fear leaves a scent, and she was steeped in it. Did you tell anyone he'd confessed that? Number, why would I? Because if you did, I said, and if someone knew he'd told you, you might have put yourself on a list. She stared down at her tea, no longer drinking it. I left her there, quiet and breathing a little too evenly. I didn't think she was a murderer, but she was standing close enough to one that the heat was starting to rise. Saul Panzer doesn't waste words. So when he stepped into the office just after noon and said, "We've got a complication," Wolfe looked up from his plate of veal tongue with mild approval. Go on. I traced the client list for Mrs. Broll's catering service, Saul said. Cross-referenced with her delivery logs. Turns out she has a long-standing Tuesday lunch order with a certain Mrs. Eloise Ferven, Donald Ferven's wife. That got Wolfe's full attention. Coincidence? I asked. Hard to say. She started ordering 6 months ago. Same building where Gregory Tile worked, different floor. Office of a charity she chairs, urban education or something. Enid Brawl's team delivered to both every Tuesday, 10 minutes apart. Wolfe frowned. The same courier? Usually, I said. And the delivery that ended Gregory's life, also a Tuesday. Saul nodded. There was a hiccup in that week's delivery. Miles told me they were running behind. Labels were prepped the night before, packed the morning of. Courier picked up 3 trays, Gregory's, Eloise's, and one for a dental firm down the block. According to logs, all were signed for. But when I spoke to the receptionist at the charity, she swears the container looked different than usual. Same order, different box. Swapped? Wolfe asked. Possibly. If so, it would have taken precise timing, or someone with influence over the courier. I narrowed my eyes. Mrs. Ferven wouldn't be the type to poison a man over bookkeeping. No, Saul said, but she might pass along a request, especially if she believed it was to protect her husband's name. Wolfe said nothing for a moment. Then, has she been interviewed by police? Not yet. Then it falls to us. He turned to Annie. Archie. Already on it, I said. That afternoon I made my way uptown to the townhouse where Mrs. Eloise Ferven lived, an address that reeked of old marble and newer money. She received me in a sitting room lined with hand-painted porcelain and the kind of calm that comes from generations of knowing the rules don't apply. I understand you were acquainted with Gregory Tile, I said. I was acquainted with his manners, she replied, which were inconsistent. Through your husband? She smiled faintly. Through lunches, Mr. Goodwin. He delivered numbers. I ordered food. I told her about the swapped container. She showed no surprise, but her tone changed, fractionally. It's unfortunate, she said, but people like Mr. Tile often create the conditions of their own demise. You believe he deserved it? I believe discretion is its own form of kindness. As I left, I scribbled a note in my pocketbook. Mrs. Ferven doesn't cook, but she knows where the knives are kept. And Wolfe? He was already sharpening his own. By now, we had enough circumstantial spaghetti to choke a jury, but Wolfe wasn't satisfied until each strand was untangled and served in perfect parallel. The next strand came courtesy of Saul Panzer, who had returned to the brownstone with a file under his arm and a look that meant something had shifted. I've got the dispatch logs, he said, and the courier statements, and I spoke again with the driver. Which driver? I asked. Heller, the one who dropped off the container at Tile's office. And Saul set the folder on Wolfe's desk. Tuesday's delivery had a discrepancy, not enough to raise flags, but there if you look. 3 containers were supposed to go to 3 locations, Gregory Tile, Mrs. Ferven's charity office, and the dental firm next door. Yes, we've heard that tune, I said. Then hum along, Saul replied. Because 2 of the containers were delivered, but one, Tile's, was logged by the driver as swapped after mislabel. I frowned. Swapped by whom? Heller claims it was a correction requested by someone from the kitchen staff, a man in a white coat who flagged him just before he pulled out. Said the labels had been reversed, swapped the boxes and sent him on. Did Heller get a name? Number said it wasn't his job to question the kitchen. Wolfe spoke for the first time in 10 minutes. Did he describe this man? Tall, dark apron, early 30s, matches. Miles, I whistled. So Miles may have intervened at the last second? Possibly, but there's a problem. Miles claims he wasn't at the kitchen that morning. He told Archie he arrived late due to a family emergency. Documented? No. I looked at Wolfe. What's the motive? Wolfe shut his eyes. That depends on whom he was helping. And why? If he swapped containers, he either knew the contents were lethal or he didn't care. And if he didn't do it? I asked. Then someone impersonated him, which implies coordination. That added a new wrinkle. Either Miles had played the game willingly, or someone else had learned the layout of the kitchen, the courier's habits, and the right moment to strike. Wolfe sighed. This delivery mix-up was no accident. It was an orchestration, and orchestration requires a composer. Later that evening, While I was at my desk, pretending to organize Wolfe's mail, Fritz appeared silently, towel over his arm and a thoughtful crease on his brow. He waited until Wolfe acknowledged him with a faint grunt. "Sir," Fritz said, "may I speak with you a moment?" "You are speaking," Wolfe said without opening his eyes. "It concerns Mrs. Broll and the containers." That got Wolfe's full attention. He opened his eyes and motioned for Fritz to continue. "Some weeks ago, perhaps 3, I was preparing a reduction when Mrs. Broll called me. She wanted advice on a vinaigrette emulsion. We spoke briefly, and before hanging up, she mentioned something curious." Wolfe arched a brow. "Curious how?" "She said one of her clients, she didn't say which, had received the wrong meal. It wasn't serious, just a mix-up, but it bothered her. She said she couldn't understand how it had happened, as the labels were clear and the containers triple-checked." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Did she suspect sabotage?" At least she didn't say so. She chalked it up to courier error, but her voice was off. She said she had a feeling someone had interfered. I thought nothing of it at the time." I leaned in. "Did she say if it was corrected?" "She said the client didn't notice. Apparently the meal was similar, just not the one ordered." I met Wolfe's gaze. "So we've got a dry run." "Precisely," Wolfe murmured. "A rehearsal." Fritz hesitated, then added, "She sounded unsettled. Not frightened, but uncharacteristically rattled." "That doesn't align with the woman we've met," I said. "No," Wolfe agreed. "It suggests that she suspected something, but lacked the framework to interpret it." "She thought it was an accident," I said. "But it was a test." Wolfe nodded once. "Which means the murder was not born of impulse, it was engineered." Fritz stepped back with a quiet bow. "That's all I wanted to report." As he departed, Wolfe leaned back and steepled his fingers. "Archie?" "Yes?" "Summon them all here, tomorrow evening." "Even Miles?" "Especially Miles." He paused. "We are nearing the point at which someone must lie convincingly, or fail. When Nero Wolfe decides to hold court, the invitation is less a request than an edict wrapped in civility. I made the calls, formally, politely, with just enough edge in my tone to suggest that refusal would be both impolite and unwise. By 6 the following evening, the office was arranged like a chessboard. Wolfe remained behind his desk, mountainous and still. I took my usual position to the left, notebook open more for performance than necessity. Fritz had prepared chilled tea, no alcohol, no distractions, and we had cleared the desk of any ornamental items. Wolfe preferred a bare table when preparing to uncover secrets. They arrived in slow, staggered order. Mrs. Enid Broll came first, appropriately anxious, dressed in subdued colors as if mourning both her reputation and the death that had triggered it. Her eyes darted like a bird anticipating glass. Miles, her assistant, slouched in 10 minutes late, hands in pockets, expression neutral enough to annoy Wolfe on principle. Risa Collings entered with poise and silence, offering the kind of smile that suggests resignation masquerading as grace. Donald and Eloise Fairvant were last, he in a dark tailored suit that threatened to outshine the room, she in gloves that probably cost more than Fritz's entire wine cellar. Wolfe had invited Lieutenant Rowcliffe too, not for his conversational talents, which were limited, but for official decorum. He was posted discreetly near the door, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He didn't like being summoned, but even Rowcliffe knew better than to ignore Wolfe when the air began to sharpen. Once everyone had settled, each suspect in their place, like variables in a careful equation, Wolfe cleared his throat with a sound like gravel beneath velvet. I flipped open my notebook, though I already knew what was coming, and judging from the looks around the room, so did a few others. Wolfe never called the orchestra until he was ready to conduct. And tonight he intended to play a symphony of guilt. Wolfe began without preamble. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the murder of Mr. Gregory Tyle was committed not by impulse but by design. It was an act reliant not upon physical strength nor passion but on foreknowledge of routines, of psychology, of the peculiarities of a man who trusted plastic more than people. That got their attention. He gestured lazily toward the center of the room, where one of Enid Broll's blue-lidded containers sat, inert and sterile, on a small oak side table. This container is, in theory, secure. It is airtight, heat-resistant, dishwasher-safe, and labeled with precision. It is meant to isolate, to protect its contents from the chaos of the world. He paused, and yet it failed. The silence in the room was as taut as a violin string. The integrity of this vessel was compromised, not by accident, but by manipulation, a swap, a switch, executed by someone who understood the vulnerability of a system that relies too much on standard procedure. Mrs. Broll leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "Then it wasn't a labeling error?" "No," Wolfe replied. "The label was correct, the contents were not." He let that settle before continuing. "We speak often of transparency, of accountability, but in truth most crimes are committed behind sealed lids, literal or otherwise. Gregory Tyle died not because of what he ate, but because of what someone knew he would do with what he ate." He looked at Risa, then at Miles, then finally at Donald Fervan. "That kind of knowledge is intimate, precise, and very dangerous." Fervan cleared his throat. "Are we being accused of something, Mr. Wolfe?" Wolfe turned to him slowly. "You are being invited to listen." Eloise Fervan crossed her legs and said nothing. Risa glanced toward the Tupperware, then away, and Miles stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Wolfe leaned back. "The integrity of plastic is fixed. The integrity of man," he said, "is negotiable." And with that, the game, real and psychological, had begun. After Wolfe's sermon on the failings of man and the susceptibility of plastic, the air thickened. Not with cigar smoke, Wolfe had banned it for the evening, but with something just as pungent, collective denial. Mrs. Broll shifted in her seat and spoke first. "I assure you, Mr. Wolfe, I checked every label twice. If a switch happened, it was after the food left my kitchen."
"I don't understand how anyone could have interfered. Unless—" Her eyes slid briefly toward Miles. Miles crossed his arms. "Don't look at me. I wasn't even in the kitchen that morning. I called in." "Convenient," I muttered. He turned his gaze to me like I'd scratched his knife set. "What motive would I have? To poison a paying client? That's not ambition, that's suicide." "You had access, and a habit of being overlooked," I replied. "I'm underpaid," he said flatly. "Not homicidal." Donald Fervan gave a derisive snort. "This is preposterous. You're playing parlor games while a man is dead." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, "I am applying reason." "Which is far more dangerous." Fervan glared. "My business is above reproach." "No," Wolfe murmured, "but it is under scrutiny." Risa, calm as ever, placed a hand in her lap. Gregory was difficult, but I had no reason to harm him. In fact, I tried to warn him. He was in trouble, but he didn't want help. He wanted control. "That sealed envelope," I said. "Did you ever see what was inside?" She hesitated. Number only that he tucked it away. Private, personal, but he seemed resigned. Eloise Fervan, who until then had remained regal and reserved, finally spoke. "My husband is not a killer, and I certainly don't poison men with catered salads. If this is an interrogation, I suggest you produce something resembling evidence." "Oh, but I shall," Wolfe said. "In due course?" There was a long, uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by the slight creak of Rowcliffe shifting near the door. Wolfe turned his head toward him slightly. "You may consider this informal," Wolfe said, "but I do not expect it to remain so." Rowcliffe gave a grunt that may have passed for assent. Wolfe returned his gaze to the room. This crime required knowledge, proximity, and a singular lack of conscience, three qualities found in abundance here tonight. Miles scoffed. "You're just trying to rattle us." "Not at all," Wolfe said. "If I were rattling you, you'd be clinking." I smiled. Not bad for a man who hated theatrics. The denials had arrived on time, polished, rehearsed, laced with plausible uncertainty. But misdirection has a smell to it, faint but persistent, and the scent was definitely in the room. Wolfe pressed a button on his desk. Fritz entered a moment later carrying a tray. On it sat two containers, identical in colour and size, both a shade of blue that evoked either culinary freshness or medical sterility, depending on your attitude toward polymers. "Thank you, Fritz," Wolfe said. He gestured toward the containers. "Observe. Two containers from the same production batch, indistinguishable to the casual eye, and yet only one of them contains the anomaly that matters." No one spoke. Saul stepped forward from the rear of the room. I hadn't even seen him arrive, which was one of Saul's many talents. He handed Wolfe a small, folded receipt. Wolfe held it up. "This," he said, "is a purchase made last month through a wholesale culinary supplier used by Mrs. Broll. Specifically, an order of 5 replacement containers. The buyer? One Mr. Miles Archer, using the account and access credentials of Mrs. Broll's business." Enid turned to Miles sharply. "You what?" Miles's mouth opened, then closed. Wolfe continued. "It was paid for with a card tied to a now-defunct auxiliary bank account registered under a limited shell entity. Dormant, but traceable. Mr. Panzer found the transaction buried among legitimate orders." Miles sat back, arms slack. I bought it as backup. One of the lids cracked. I didn't want you blaming me." "Then why not tell her?" I asked. "She was already riding me about costs." Wolfe grunted. "A man who lies to avoid scrutiny invites deeper inspection. The container used to deliver the poisoned meal to Mr. Tyle was not one of the originals from Mrs. Broll's pre-stocked inventory. It was from this auxiliary batch. No fingerprints, no smudges, no DNA. And how?" said Rowcliffe, arms folded. "Do you know it was that container?" Wolfe gave him a look of mild contempt. "Because Saul found the remaining 4. He let that sink in. "Only one is unaccounted for. And that one," Wolfe said, pointing to the duplicate on the tray, "was substituted for the original, which was discarded efficiently and silently." Enid was pale. "Miles, why?" Miles stared at the container like it might suddenly confess on his behalf. "I didn't poison anyone." "Then who used it?" I asked. "I don't know." Wolfe's voice turned cold. "Someone gave you a reason. Perhaps money, perhaps leverage, perhaps a promise." Miles shook his head slowly. "I was told to mislabel one order, that's all. Just switch the tags. I didn't know it would kill him." "Who told you?" He swallowed. "I didn't get a name. Just a call. Said they'd pay double my salary. I thought it was some corporate sabotage, rival caterers. I didn't ask." "You didn't ask?" Enid snapped. "You put my food in someone's coffin and you didn't ask?"
Wolfe raised a hand. The room quieted. "What did they tell you to label it as?" Miles hesitated. "Charity. The fervent charity tray." I looked at Wolfe. "Which explains," he said softly, "how Mr. Tyle received the death meant for his own silence." And the room, for the first time that night, truly stilled. Miles had reached that particular shade of pallor usually reserved for the faintly ill or the newly unemployed. His hands were clenched into fists, but not with resolve, more like a man holding tightly to the last shreds of a lie he was beginning to doubt himself. "I didn't know what was in it," he said again, this time not to Wolfe or Enid, or even to Rowcliffe, but to himself, as if he needed to hear it aloud before he could believe it. "Let us be clear," Wolfe said, his voice unhurried but unyielding. "You admit that you deliberately switched the labels on 2 containers. You did so at the request of a party you cannot name, for a fee you cannot prove, with no explanation of purpose." Miles swallowed. "They said it was harmless. A message. Something about product placement, competition in catering. I thought they wanted to embarrass her." "You thought," Wolfe echoed, "a most useful justification after the fact." "It was business," Miles mumbled. "No," Wolfe said, "it was cowardice." Enid turned to him, her voice shaking. "You sabotaged my company, my reputation, on a hunch?" He winced. I didn't mean— That's the problem, Wolfe interrupted. You didn't mean anything. You acted without purpose, without principle, and now you seek refuge in ignorance. Miles looked at the floor. Rowcliffe cleared his throat. That's a confession, Wolfe. To complicity, Wolfe replied. Not to murder. At that, Donald Fervin shifted in his chair, the first crack in his composure. Wolfe caught it like a hawk spotting a twitch in the grass. Mr. Fervin, he said softly, do you deny that you contacted Miles Archer? Fervin straightened. I deny everything, Mr. Wolfe. I don't make backroom deals with kitchen staff. And yet, Wolfe said, his contact traced to a burner phone, one purchased 2 blocks from your office. Saul Panzer retrieved the receipt this morning. Fervin's mouth opened, closed. I can't be held responsible for what this boy did. You can, Wolfe said, if you orchestrated it. Miles's voice cracked. He didn't say kill, he said deliver a warning. To whom? Wolfe asked. To the charity, he said. To make a point. And did you wonder, Wolfe said coldly, why the client of record was suddenly Mr. Tyle, not the charity? Did you question the possibility that a message might become a murder? Miles stared down. No. Wolfe leaned back. Then you are a fool, but not the only one. And just like that, the air was suddenly too thin. Because the lid hadn't just been switched, it had been prepared. Wolfe gestured, and Fritz returned, not with a flourish, but with a tray bearing a final piece of evidence, the actual container, preserved in a sealed evidence bag, edges clean, surface untouched by hand. You will note, Wolfe said, that the container was pristine, devoid of prints, as previously stated. But what you may not know, Lieutenant, is that the autopsy revealed no ingestion of poison through digestion. None. Rowcliffe blinked. Then how— It was absorbed, Wolfe said, through the mucous membrane, specifically the victim's mouth. Donald Fervin let out an impatient sigh. What are you saying? He inhaled it? No, Wolfe said. He licked it. That got them all. What? Risa whispered. Archie, for once, let the silence linger. Wolfe continued. Gregory Tyle had an old, peculiar habit, documented by a former secretary, observed by 2 co-workers, and corroborated by Saul Panzer, who retrieved a personal notebook from Tyle's apartment. He turned slightly toward the center of the room. He was a compulsive container licker, cleanliness-obsessed. Before disposing of a plastic lid, he would run his tongue along the rim to remove any residual dressing, oil, or flavor, a habit he considered efficient, a habit known only to a few. He turned his gaze on Risa. To whom, for instance, would he have confessed such an eccentricity? Risa opened her mouth. No sound came out. You were close, Wolfe said. Closer than you wanted to admit in this room. You may have broken ties romantically, but psychologically you were entangled. He trusted you. I didn't, she began. You warned him, Wolfe said, but someone else had access to the information, someone you confided in, or perhaps someone who overheard. Wolfe allowed the tension to simmer. There was no need to poison the food. The method was more elegant, more surgical, a precise application of toxin, odorless, colorless, activated by contact with mucosa, applied not to the contents but to the rim of the container. Eloise Fervin spoke then, voice tight. What kind of monster thinks of that? A careful one, Wolfe said, a meticulous one, and one who needed the death to be explained as food contamination without ever revealing the fatal vector. He turned again to Risa. You told someone? She looked at Wolfe with a terrible, brittle calm. He was in trouble. I told Donald. He said he could help, that he'd make it go away. You told him about the lid? No, she said. But I told him Gregory couldn't help himself, that he cleaned things, that he hated waste. That, Wolfe said, was enough. Rowcliffe stepped forward, hand inching toward his notepad. Wolfe held up a palm. In due time, there is more. But that proves it, I said. The lid was the weapon? No, Wolfe said. It was the trigger. He stood, slowly, deliberately. And now we must identify who cocked the gun. The room had dropped into that particular hush I've only heard in two places, cathedrals and Wolfe's office at the edge of confession. Risa sat still, lips parted, hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if she could physically restrain the truth. But it was already leaking through the tightness in her jaw, the tremor in her fingers, and the fact that she hadn't denied Wolfe's accusation. "You told Fervin?" Wolfe said. It wasn't a question. She looked up at him, a line of color rising in her cheeks. "I didn't mean it like that." "What did you mean?" I asked. She hesitated. "Gregory told me everything, about the money, the pressure, the client. He was cracking, and he was scared." Her voice broke slightly, and for once I didn't think it was theatrical. I told Donald we'd spoken before. He knew Gregory handled his accounts. I thought if I explained the situation discreetly, he could make it go away quietly. I thought he'd help. "That," Wolfe said flatly, "was optimism of a fatal kind." "I didn't know what he would do," she said. "But you suspected," Wolfe countered. "You suspected enough to keep your distance, enough to say nothing after Gregory died." She looked down. "I received a gift basket the next day," she said. "From an anonymous sender. Imported chocolate, ribboned wine. There was no card." "And that," Wolfe murmured, "was your reward." Donald Fervin made a sound, half a snort, half a scoff, but his wife silenced him with a glance that would have frozen coffee. Rowcliffe straightened as if his cuffs had grown heavier. Wolfe merely sighed. "You tipped the first domino," he told Risa, and allowed Mr. Fervin to line the rest. "I didn't know," she said again, but this time with less conviction. "Knowing," Wolfe said, "is not always required to be guilty." "But you knew enough." Risa didn't answer. And in that silence, the weight of the thing she had set in motion finally settled on her shoulders. She bowed her head, not in shame precisely, but in recognition, which, as Wolfe would later tell me, is as close to remorse as some people ever come. Wolfe allowed the confession to rest a moment longer, then turned his gaze back to Miles, who had shrunk into his chair like a melting wax figure. "You may exhale, Mr. Archer," he said. "You are not a murderer." Miles blinked. What?" "You are a fool," Wolfe continued, "a coward, and a liability in any kitchen that values integrity, but you are not a killer. You acted without intent to harm, which is both your defense and your indictment." Rowcliffe grunted. "Accessory, maybe, or obstruction." "That," Wolfe replied, "I leave to the district attorney." Miles looked at Enid, whose expression was no longer sharp with fury, but simply tired. "I didn't want anyone to die," he said quietly. "No," Wolfe said, "but you didn't want to be questioned either, and you succeeded at neither." He turned slightly toward Enid. "I imagine your sous chef's position is now vacant." She gave a small nod. "Indefinitely." "As it should be." Wolfe sat back, fingers steepled. "The container was switched by your hand, Mr. Archer, but it was prepared by another, and the poison was planted by someone who knew precisely where Gregory Tyle's compulsions would lead him." He shifted his gaze one final time to Donald Fervin. "And that, Mr. Fervin, makes you not merely a manipulator, but a murderer with an eye for detail." Fervin said nothing, but his silence was no longer defensive. It was admission. Wolfe shifted in his chair, the movement deliberate, final. His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on each face, not with judgment, but with an unmistakable sense of conclusion. The performance, at least for some, was over. "You are all dismissed," he said, "except Mr. Fervin." The silence broke in a scattered murmur. Risa rose slowly, nodding once, her face pale but unflinching. Enid stood without looking at Miles, who followed her like a man already shadowed by consequences. Rowcliffe, though hesitant, obeyed Wolfe's glance and exited behind them, the door hissing shut like punctuation. Donald Fervin remained seated. Eloise made to speak, but Wolfe cut her off with a flick of his fingers. "Not you, madam, not this time. She stiffened, then turned and exited, heels sharp against the floor. Now there were three. Wolfe, myself, and Donald Fervin, who sat perfectly still, the only sound in the room the ticking of the clock and the careful inhale of Wolfe before he spoke again. "Mr. Fervin," he said calmly, "you may now abandon the pretense of innocence. It has served its purpose." Fervin's lips curled faintly. "You've made quite the production, Mr. Wolfe." "Yes," Wolfe replied. "Now let us address the script." I uncapped my pen. Something told me this would be worth writing down. "You knew," Wolfe said, "that Gregory Tyle was embezzling from your accounts, not enough to bankrupt you, but enough to embarrass you, if disclosed?" Fervin said nothing. "You also knew that exposure, even without legal consequence, would tarnish your name in circles where credibility is currency." Still silence. Wolfe continued, as if reading from a file only he could see. "You confronted him. He refused to reverse the paper trail. You approached Ms. Collings, who, in her loyalty or her guilt, attempted to mediate. When mediation failed, you pursued a more permanent solution." "You have no proof," Fervin said. "No?" Wolfe tilted his head. "Mr. Panzer located a phone purchased in cash 2 days before the murder from a kiosk frequented by your driver. Its number was used to contact Miles Archer, offering him double his salary for a labeling correction." Fervin folded his arms. "The call was traced to a tower that serves your corporate office. The time aligns with a 30-minute gap in your schedule, a gap you attributed to a personal errand." Wolfe tapped the edge of the container on his desk. "You arranged for a replacement container to be introduced into the delivery chain, one purchased using credentials from Mrs. Broll's account. You provided Archer with enough instruction to execute the switch, but withheld the full truth. You didn't need him to understand, you needed him to obey." Fervin's eyes darkened. "This is still circumstantial." "Hardly," Wolfe said. "You also knew about Gregory's habit of licking the inside rim of plastic lids. That information could only have come from someone close, Risa Collings, perhaps, in a careless remark. Or perhaps you observed it yourself in some boardroom lunch or offhand moment." Wolfe leaned forward slightly, his voice low and unwavering. "You exploited a man's compulsive nature. You used his own quirks as the delivery mechanism for your crime. The poison was applied precisely, on the rim, where only Gregory's own ritual would activate it. A cleaner crime has rarely been conceived." "Except that it failed," Fervin said. "You're here, not the police." "Oh, but they will be," Wolfe said. "Lieutenant Rowcliffe, though inflexible in mind, is punctual with paperwork, and the file he now carries contains everything I've described, including Miles's signed statement, Risa's confession of disclosure, and the receipt for the burner phone." Fervin stood, slowly adjusting his cuffs. "I'm a public man, Mr. Wolfe. This won't stick." "It will smother," Wolfe replied. "You built your name on controlled appearances. This will stain every tie you wear." Fervin gave me a glance. "Enjoy the spotlight, Mr. Goodwin." "I always do," I said. He walked to the door, paused, and then turned back. "You're not half as clever as you think." "No," Wolfe said, "but I'm precisely as clever as I need to be." And as the door closed behind Donald Fervin, the case, like the container, was sealed. But only Wolfe knew whether it would stay that way. The door had barely finished clicking shut behind Donald Fervin when Wolfe's gaze returned, like a lighthouse beam sweeping back toward rocky shores. Only this time it found Risa Collings, who had edged back into the room uninvited but not unnoticed. She stood by the edge of the office, hands clasped in front of her, eyes trained on the floor. She hadn't left with the others, which told me something about her instincts and her guilt. Wolfe didn't rise. He didn't need to. "Miss Collings," he said, "you did not commit murder." "That distinction belongs to Mr. Fervin, but you opened the door." She didn't respond. "You gave him what he needed. You didn't mean to, no, but you did. You knew Gregory's quirks, his habits, his fears, and more important, his compulsions. You knew how he would eat, and that he would never leave a trace of dressing behind on a plastic lid. She raised her head, eyes bright with something between defiance and despair. I told him because I thought he could help. Gregory was unraveling. He needed someone to step in. You thought Mr. Ferven would be that someone? Wolfe asked, unimpressed. He promised to fix it. He said the story would never reach the board, that it would be handled. Quietly. And so it was, Wolfe said, but not in the way you imagined. She took a step forward, then stopped herself. I didn't know it would lead to this. No, Wolfe said, his voice now gentler, but you suspected it might. You knew Mr. Ferven was not a man of delicate solutions. Reza looked at me. Is this where you ask for a confession? I shook my head. Number, we already have it. Wolfe interjected. Your silence after Gregory's death was the confession. Your continued association with Mr. Ferven after the fact confirmed it. Her voice barely a whisper now. Then what happens to me? That, Wolfe said, folding his hands, depends on how well the district attorney values cooperation and how thoroughly Mr. Ferven is willing to trade names when the cell door shuts. She didn't speak again, and when she turned to go, there was nothing of drama in her posture. Only the resigned stillness of someone who had finally heard the truth, said aloud. By the time Lieutenant Rowcliffe re-entered the office, Wolfe had already returned to his chair and composed himself with the serenity of a man who had not only solved the puzzle, but laid each piece in a tidy row. The lieutenant looked between Wolfe and the door Risa had just exited. Are we done now? We are finished, Wolfe said. Whether you are done is a separate matter. Rowcliffe huffed and pulled a notepad from his jacket. I'll need your statement, and the evidence. Wolfe gestured to the thick envelope on the corner of his desk. You will find transcripts of all relevant interviews, Saul Panzer's timeline of the burner phone purchase, Fred Durkin's courier route logs, the container batch tracking numbers, and Mr. Miles Archer's written confession. Rowcliffe narrowed his eyes at the weighty packet. And just like that, you expect the DA to run with it? I expect, Wolfe said evenly, that the district attorney will read it, confirm the facts and proceed accordingly, preferably before Mr. Ferven's legal counsel begins reconstructing a version of reality involving aliens and gluten intolerance. Rowcliffe reached for the envelope, but paused. You're sure he'll crack? Wolfe sniffed. He already has. His silence was a luxury, not a defense. And now that luxury is spent, I added. Besides, the public may forget a poisoned man, but they rarely forget a scandal involving tampered lunch deliveries, especially one with upper-crust fingerprints on the Tupperware. Rowcliffe muttered something about lawyers and red tape, but took the envelope under one arm and turned to go. Lieutenant, Wolfe said. Rowcliffe looked back. Do ensure that Mrs. Brawl's reputation is cleared. Her cooking, unlike her containers, has integrity. The lieutenant gave a curt nod and departed. I leaned back in my chair. Think they'll charge Risa too? They may, Wolfe said, but I expect she'll be useful. And usefulness in the justice system is a highly negotiable form of redemption. He closed his eyes, and just like that the machinery of the law was engaged, not with sirens or cuffs, but with paper, ink, and a sealed envelope, Wolfe's preferred instruments of execution. At precisely 8 o'clock, Fritz entered with a bottle of Côte du Rhône, chilled, dry, and, judging by the faint gleam in Wolfe's eye, utterly appropriate. 2 glasses were poured. Wolfe motioned for a third. To Mrs. Brawl? I asked. To culinary perseverance, Wolfe corrected, despite sabotage, scandal, and sous chefs of questionable spine. We raised our glasses. He sipped, sighed, and leaned back. Archie? Yes? The next time anyone offers to deliver lunch in plastic, refuse, politely but firmly. I nodded. You planning to issue a manifesto on the dangers of modern food storage? No, Wolfe said, but I may issue a ban. Fritz returned with a silver tray bearing 2 neatly plated tartlets. No Tupperware in sight, I observed. Wolfe looked over the meal, then raised his glass once more. "To integrity," he said. "Of character or cuisine?" I asked. He considered. "Both, but chiefly the latter." We drank, and for the first time in days the brownstone felt like itself again, warm, orderly, and blissfully devoid of sealed containers. 3 days had passed since the last of the statements were signed, the last courier interviewed, and the last Tupperware container removed from the brownstone with an unceremonious thud. In that time, Wolfe had returned to his routines, orchids, beer, books, while I handled the bureaucratic aftermath like a man filing papers inside a tornado. So when Mrs. Enid Brawl telephoned and asked, tentatively, whether Mr. Wolfe might consider a modest culinary gesture, I didn't laugh. I checked his schedule. I even asked him. He didn't say yes. Wolfe rarely does. He merely said, provided Fritz oversees every stage of its receipt, plating, and presentation, I will permit a single-course evaluation, which in Wolfe speak is the equivalent of a standing ovation. The dish arrived in insulated wrapping, not plastic, and was promptly handed off to Fritz, who unwrapped it with the reverence of a man diffusing a diplomatic crisis. It was, as promised, one of Mrs. Brawl's signature creations, a chilled vichyssoise with fennel and lemon zest, accompanied by a wafer-thin sourdough crisp and a small ramekin of spiced crème fraîche. Wolfe stared at it. Fritz nodded, arms folded. I hovered near the archway with the air of someone who wouldn't admit to being curious. With his customary deliberation, Wolfe lifted the spoon and tasted. There was a pause, a brief, dangerous pause, then he swallowed and took another. He didn't speak, he didn't scowl, but he nodded, just once. It was the nod of a man who would allow truth into his mouth if it were correctly seasoned. "Well?" I asked, feigning disinterest. He wiped the corner of his mouth. "She is exonerated." Fritz let out a breath that might have doubled as a prayer. Wolfe turned to me. "Tell her that the seasoning is precise, the balance restrained, the finish elegant." "That's high praise from you." "It is praise," Wolfe said. "Let us leave it at that." I jotted a quick note for Mrs. Brawl. She would receive more than legal redemption. She would receive Wolfe's palate, and that, in certain circles, was rarer than a pardon from the governor. Fritz didn't say much that afternoon. He didn't need to. The man radiated a quiet joy that hung in the kitchen like the scent of warm brioche. I found him wiping down the counter, actually humming, while polishing a copper pot that didn't look like it needed it. "She passed the test," I said, leaning against the doorway. He nodded. "She never should have been tested." "True, but you stood up for her." "She is no genius," Fritz said, carefully polishing the lip of the saucepan. "But she respects the ingredients." "Wolfe respects that," I said. He smiled. "More than most people." I turned to go, but paused at the threshold. "You know, I don't think I've ever seen him finish a dish from an outside kitchen without asking for a salt shaker." Fritz gave a soft chuckle. That was his way of apologizing. "He didn't say sorry." "No," Fritz agreed. But he cleared the bowl. In Wolfe's world, there are few triumphs higher than an empty dish, and in Fritz's, none more sacred. That night I poured myself a small bourbon and raised a toast to the innocence of soup, the betrayal of lids, and the fact that nobody had asked me to taste anything during the entire case. Wolfe was already in his room, muttering about pollen counts and the audacity of spring. I made a note for the kitchen bulletin board. All plastic containers to be handled as though armed. It got a laugh from Fritz. "I've seen bodies, I've seen bullets, I've seen poison disguised in perfume and hidden in powder, but I'll tell you straight, nothing unnerves a man quite like a blue-lidded bowl he can't account for. From now on, I'll take my meals in glass, thank you. And if someone hands me something sealed, I'll hand it right back." The following morning, Wolfe broke a rare silence at breakfast. He looked at his poached eggs, then at me. "You know, Archie," he said, "a sealed container may preserve what is inside, but it cannot prevent what is already corrupt." I waited. He lifted a fork. "Human nature," he said, "spoils faster." Then he resumed eating. I let him have the last word. This time it was worth it.